All right, guys, good news and bad news. Bad news first. The bad news is that the proofs are back. And the good news is that it's actually not as bad as it was previously. It's a lot less abstract, and we're only dealing with congruent triangles. So we're proving that there are at least two triangles are congruent to each other. So let's see what are some of the definitions. Congruent triangles are triangles with the same shape as well as the same size. So what does that mean? That means the corresponding, let me write this down first, same shape and the same size means that the corresponding parts, meaning the angles and the size, the angles and the sides are congruent. So they're congruency statements. When triangles are congruent, we can write a congruency statement, and that statement looks just like this. Triangle ABC is congruent to triangle DEF. What does that mean? If we use the definition from the top, the sides, the corresponding sides, so AB, if you look at this, one tick mark, and ED, one tick mark, is congruent, right? And then there are two tick marks here. I'm going to use blue. BC and FE are congruent. And then the third side, AC, let me use a different color. I'll use red. And FD are congruent. So these are corresponding sides. There are three, because it's a triangle, there are three sides, so therefore there are three pairs of corresponding sides, and each pair is congruent. Same thing with angles. There's angle A is congruent to angle D, and angle B and angle E are congruent. And then finally, angle C and angle F with the three tick marks are congruent to each other, right? So that's what it means. So all three sides as well as all three angles have to be congruent to each other. Now, why that is the case? So I can give you a simple example. That's a small triangle, and that's a big triangle. And I can tell you that these two angles are congruent, these two angles are congruent, and these third angles are congruent. However, none of the sides are congruent. So these two triangles are not, they're proportional, but they're not congruent to each other. Okay? Finally, there's a concept called CPCDC. You're like, what's that? It stands for corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. Corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent, which is really just what we talked about, what we demonstrated on top with triangle ABC and DEF. Now, let's look at some examples. Here, it says, list all congruent angles and sides given the congruency statements. So the congruency statement is here. Two triangles are congruent. Notice that, be careful with sequence. When you write it this way, I'm marking it down with different shapes. So the two red arrows, J and Q, they're angles, and these two are congruent. So we have to write it down. Angle J is congruent to angle P. And angle K is congruent to angle Q. And then angle L is congruent to angle R. Okay? So in other words, when you write congruency statements, the order of the letters matter because they have to match up with the corresponding angles in the second triangle. That's why the order really matters. Now, earlier we talked about between two triangles there are corresponding sides and there's corresponding angles. Within one triangle, and I'll give you an example here, I'm going to draw it here. Within one triangle, there's also a relationship between the sides and the angles. So when we look at one angle, let's take angle A for example, we're always looking at the opposite sides, the opposite side as a pair. And if you look at angle B, the corresponding side to angle B is angle C. So because of that, angle J and angle P are congruent. Their corresponding sides, which is JK, and if you should really graph this out, or you should just follow this order. The first two letters JK has to be congruent to PQ. And then KL is congruent to QR. Look at the order of the letters. Then finally JL is congruent to PR. Okay, so it's much easier if you make a graph on the side of the paper. So the congruency statement is KJL is congruent to triangle QPR. That's another way, and you can even make it the third way, make the third angle be the first letter and start from there. So pause the video and finish practice number 2 by yourself. Answer key is online. And I will only do half of number 3. In this case, the diagrams are given, but they're flip-flopped, right? They're not lined up exactly with each other, so you have to be extra careful with this. So what I always do is I start with an angle. I see two obtuse angle, Y and P, so I put that in. So if they are congruent with each other, and then another way to look at it is that I look for the shortest side, PM and CY. Do I have PM here? I don't have PM. I have CY, so PM and CY are congruent. And because PM and CY are congruent, their corresponding angle, so PM, opposite side is angle K, and CY, the opposite side has to be angle A. They must be congruent, right? So then the rest of it is pretty much self-explanatory. You can finish the rest of it. I think that's it on this sheet. Next page. Some additional practices. This time, you're given specific measurements of the angles, so you can just find the angles. I'm going to do number 5, which is the specific measure for the sides are also given. Oh, sides and angle are also given. So let's look at this. GJ should be congruent to ZX, therefore it's 18 feet. XY should be congruent to HG, so it's 27. Notice there are 2 tick marks. That means it's an isosceles triangle. HJ and HG are the same. ZY and XY are the same. So they're congruent, right? Angle H should be congruent to angle Y at 38 degrees. And angle Z and angle J should be congruent because if these 2 sides are congruent, these 2 angles are congruent. Same thing here. These 2 angles are congruent. Now, if angle Z plus angle measure of X plus 38 should equal 180. And if these 2 are the same, if angle Z is X, angle X is X. So 2X plus 38 equals 180. And your final answer should be 71 degrees for each. All right, so number 6 should be exactly the same except that there's some algebra involved. Let's see, the 2 triangles are congruent. So then the setup should be 12x minus 7 should equal 53. And 12x should equal 60, therefore x equals 5. So that's your final answer for x. Same thing for y. You can set it up for y. Okay, so finish the rest of it, and I will write the answer for here for your convenience. If you have any questions, bring it back to class. See you soon, guys. Bye.